Hello. Controls. It's not something most people think about when playing a video game. 90% of the time, the control is introduced to you, you learn to correlate that action to the button press of the correct button, and then it becomes a seamless part of gameplay. You don't need to think about what button you press every time, you know which button to press intrinsically. This is fine in and of itself, but what happens when a game isn't that simple? Fighting games, for example, used to always confuse me. Whoever was unfortunate enough to teach me anything would go, okay, X is punch, Y is kick, A is jump, B is block, have fun, and would then proceed to use the Mega Whiplash Apocalypse 9000 special move in the ensuing match, leading to the inevitable, wait, how'd you do that? The control scheme of the fighting game wasn't complicated, but the way the combat system flowed together with the inputs made it so. Right off the bat, you have a small amount of controls, but there are seemingly infinite options. Not to mention one layer deeper, where certain moves won't work against certain characters because it's not safe on block, and you have too much wind up and the frame data won't be in your favor, and you forgot to divide the multiplication of the move's hitbox area, and it feels like you need one of those giant fold-up maps just to play a video game. On the opposite end of the spectrum are games that have little to no controls and still manage to be nearly impossible to play without hours upon hours of game time or third-party assistance. The difficulty doesn't come from not knowing how to play from a sense of control, but from the lack thereof. Real-time strategy games have always eluded me in this way. It's simple enough to place buildings and get more guys to go place more buildings, but knowing which buildings to place and which guys you need at that specific moment never came naturally to me. I would inevitably resort to becoming the resident farm lord and give all the resources to the people who actually knew what they were doing. It often felt like I was put in a sandbox. I was given a plastic rake, a castle mold, everything I needed for a successful foray to a good time. But while I was working on making a small sand farm for my single-towered keep, my friends had already discovered sand particle acceleration. In my mind, Hollow Knight hits a perfect middle ground between these two philosophies. The control scheme is simple and stays that way. No hidden mechanics, no combos, no Mega Whiplash Apocalypse 9000. Just you and your nail against the world. You're dropped into the same sandbox, but everyone is on the same playing field. The enemies act the same way to everybody, no one has a leg up on anyone else, it's just you and your nail. And on the other side of the field is a literal god and her army of underlings, but that's not the point. The point is, Hollow Knight's controls make the player feel capable of taking on said army, while also making it fun at the same time. Arguably the most important thing in any game ever, but that's a topic for another video. All of this to say that Hollow Knight's controls are great. It's tickled my speedrunning fancy and still keeps me entranced after 2,000 hours of playtime. However, something was still nagging in the back of my mind. I'd been speedrunning for this long, but more so than how fast I was beating the game, I'd never considered how many times I was hitting the buttons. See, I bet you already forgot what this video was originally about. Which is exactly my point. You don't really think about how you're playing the game while you're playing the game. Well, that ends now. Today, we're going to figure out exactly how many inputs it takes to beat Hollow Knight. But how to go about this? When I first came up with this concept, my original plan was to analyze 5 different casual playthroughs of Hollow Knight, input by input, frame by frame, meticulously counting everything that happened on screen like I was the monkey in Toy Story. However, and thank God for this, one of my friends overheard me talking and said, "Dude, please do not do that. I can just create a bot to count everything for you." So that's what we did. Here's how the bot works. Put on your smart glasses because there's a lot of layers to this. There are a certain number of actions the bot will need to look out for. Directional input, jump, attack, spell, focus, dash, anytime we enter dialogue, crystal dash, dream nail, dive, and then just for fun, how many hits the player takes, as well as the total number of deaths in the playthrough. The bot, which I'm going to name Harold because otherwise I would be saying the bot a lot, and this will be more fun, is programmed in Python and uses a codebase called OpenCV. Basically, this is what allows Harold to view and analyze the video input that we'll be feeding him. Speaking of, let's take a look at what Harold looks like in action. Pretty confusing, right? Let's take this piece by piece. The numbers on the left are pretty self-explanatory, but let's take a look at what's happening with the knight first. This yellow square you see is Harold's viewpoint. Basically, it's what Harold sees at any given time. Well, really, this is what Harold is seeing. He only needs to see black and white for the action tracking, and it happens to save a lot on processing power to not need to differentiate between colors. This is because the brightness on screen is very important for a few of the actions Harold is checking for. Again, we'll get into why in a bit. Anyways, Harold tracks the knight via a process known as template matching. Basically, Harold has a folder filled with images of actions the knight could do at any given moment that he would need to track. Here's what those look like. This means that every single frame of video that's fed through Harold is analyzed for every single one of these images, unless the knight is incapable of doing one of those actions, meaning Harold won't be checking to see if the knight is shrieking if the knight hasn't picked up Howling Wraiths yet. There's many things Harold does to save on processing, and this is one of them. Here's what the template matching looks like while Harold is running. Now is a good time to explain how Harold actually counts an input. Harold's counting runs on what's called a confidence rating. He never actually knows 100% what input was pressed. Each line you see on screen is Harold saying, "This looks a bit like one of the templates," and is then comparing the thing seen to said template. This is why you see the lines darting out to random points at random times. If the thing that's seen doesn't seem to match the template, it won't add much at all to the confidence rating. Now, look at what happens when the knight actually does a dash. See how many of the lines go from the template to the knight? That's Harold saying, "Hey, I'm at least 90% sure this thing that just happened on screen is a dash." The input is finally counted when Harold's confidence rating goes over a certain threshold, which differs from ability to ability. It's easier to tell some actions apart from others. Once an action hits that confidence threshold and an action is counted, all other actions are then deactivated for a certain number of frames, depending on the original action. This is because, again, depending on what action the knight takes, the knight will be stuck in that action's animation. For example, if the knight is using a dash, all other abilities are locked for 15 frames. Just another thing to save on processing power. And that's basically how template matching works. However, there are several actions here that don't have a clear animation to create a template off of. For example, the nails swinging animation is completely random. Not only this, but Harold is watching the videos at 30 frames per second, of which the nail swing is only visible for 1. This makes it nigh impossible to track via a template. This is where the secondary form of input counting comes into play, and it has to do with the brightness that I mentioned before. There's a few other inputs that also have the same kind of issue as nail, namely focusing for a heal and shooting a fireball. Thankfully, all 3 of these create a bright light near the knight. Remember, Harold only sees in black and white, so when Harold senses a bright light happening in the knight's immediate vicinity, multiple things happen all at once. Firstly, a bright light is detected near the knight in one of the cardinal directions, above, below, and to either side. Secondly, 3 different detectors are all activated at the same time. Really, it's just the nail detector, but both the fireball and healing detectors piggyback off of info from it. The first check that's run is the nail check. Harold checks to see 2 things. Is the light in the direction the knight is facing? And does the light end in the knight's immediate vicinity? If both of these are true, the nail counter is incremented by 1, and all of the other non-light-based action counters are locked. However, all 3 of these abilities are capable of creating the light for the nail check, so Harold has to ask a few more questions. The fireball detector runs next and checks for a few things. Is the light continuing past the knight's immediate vicinity? And is soul being consumed? This is why the yellow view window becomes larger whenever the knight swings his nail. Harold is double checking to see if the nail swing is actually a fireball. If both these things are true, Harold corrects the nail count and adds 1 to the fireball count. Now there's only 1 check left that could be confused for either of the first 2. Healing both consumes soul and creates light in the direction of the knight is facing. So there's a few final questions Harold needs to ask. The heal detector checks for these 3 things. Was soul consumed? Did a mask appear during this time? And did the light appear behind and above the knight as well as in front of him? If all these are true, the fireball count is taken away and the heal count is incremented. Okay, that about covers all the inputs. Now, the elephant in the room. In something as fast-paced and noise-heavy as Hollow Knight, there's bound to be a lot of errors. All the real work comes from Harold sifting through this noise, deciding what are actual inputs, and ignoring or correcting any false positives. We calculated that of all the inputs that happen in the playthroughs, Harold will only be able to accurately tell what they are around 80% of the time, which is still really good. I'm only saying this so we know that there's a 20% margin of error for the final input count. Before we get into the analysis, there's one tiny accidental oversight that's going to mess with our data. When looking for playthroughs to analyze, I tried to find sets of videos without any cuts, because anything other than 100% of the playthrough's gameplay would be unfaithful to the idea of the video. I failed to do my due diligence, and one of the playthroughs we analyzed unfortunately did just that. In my defense, who only makes their first video to be uninterrupted gameplay and then switches to making edits for every video after? Anyways, with all that, we're finally ready to start examining our playthroughs. Harold will be counting the inputs up until the player beats the Hollow Knight. Most of the playthroughs continued after the fact, but for the sake of this video, we're only concerned with the first time the players reach the credits. On top of the 5 casual playthroughs, I decided to add the world record any % speedrun by Skate King, just to scratch that speedrunning itch. Just for a bit of context, here's how long each of these runs ran for. It'll be interesting to see how much the overall playtime affects the input count. As you can probably tell, this one is the one with cuts in it. Keep in mind, the other playthroughs are pretty much uninterrupted VODs, so they include any breaks or what have you that would occur during a normal stream. No inputs happen during this time, so it wouldn't affect our count anyways. As a side note, this video took 5 months to work on, simply because of how much processing time it took Harold to analyze all of these hours of footage. On average, it took him 4 to 8 seconds to analyze 1 second of footage, depending on what was happening at any given time. Anyways, let's see the final input count for each playthrough. If you look closely, there are some interesting things going on. Despite this playthrough having cuts and being 9 hours shorter than the next shortest, it still had around the same dash, dive, crystal heart, and spell inputs. Also, this person really loved talking to NPCs because they somehow managed to barely miss second place for most dialogues entered, despite having around half the runtime of the other players. Something else interesting I noticed is that nobody used spells that much. The highest spell count ended up being only around 1.4 spells used per minute, and that was the longest playthrough. The next highest spells per minute was 1.2. This kind of makes sense. I don't remember using spells that much in my own casual playthrough, only learning their true value after I started speedrunning. Another interesting tidbit is how wildly the attack input varies between these playthroughs, despite how different the lengths are. The highest nail count is 56,319, the next highest being 44,761, and then a staggering jump down to third place at 18,981. The difference between the highest and lowest attack count is around 48,000 inputs. Again though, that's comparing against the run with cuts in it, so take that with a grain of salt. If we ignore this lowest nail count, the difference becomes 45,936, which is only around 2,000 less, so I guess it's not that big a deal. These first 2 playthroughs are heavily going to weigh down our average. Speaking of, shall we take a look at what an average Hollow Knight playthrough looks like? We can do this by adding up each corresponding input from every playthrough and dividing by 5, since that's the number of playthroughs we're looking at. Doing that, we get this. A mathematically correct, casual Hollow Knight. But wait, this doesn't feel satisfying enough. If you know anything about this channel so far, you know I like to take things even further beyond. But how to do this? Looking at the world record run, the differences are simply staggering. Do take these with a grain of salt though. In a speedrun, you're spamming nail and spell so much in fights, Harold often misses picking them up, simply because they happen too close to each other for him to be able to differentiate them. But I feel like we can still go even further. But how? Well, I suppose if someone were completely off their rocker insane, they would go through every single room of the any % speedrun and plan out each specific input that they would need to get through that room, repeated ad nauseum until the end of the run. But that's the most tedious, boring, asinine thing to do, and nobody in their right mind would. It's me. I did it. It took 14 hours, and it's done. Honestly, it felt very reminiscent of when I was routing out the blindfolded run. I'll include the link to the Google Doc I did the input planning in the description, but fair warning, it's a little hard to read. It was a lot simpler than blindfolded, thankfully, and definitely took less time, around 12 hours total. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to be tracking the HP of the knight during this experiment. We're going to assume all the enemies will give the best RNG and will be out of our way / within Nail's reach at the perfect time, always. Due to this, while some damage boosts might have saved inputs at certain points, I thought it only fair to not count them due to this caveat. This goes double, maybe even triple, for bosses, whose RNG is nigh unpredictable at times. For bosses, we will purely be counting mathematically how many nail and spell inputs it takes to reduce their HP to 0. Again, it would be very, very difficult to get a consistent input range for bosses due to their RNG. Also, we're going to assume we have enough geo to buy the things we need when we need to buy them. I will be as charitable as possible to these caveats in the sense that if something seems too unrealistic, I'll take that into account. Hope that's okay. Anyways, there are a couple of the bosses which we'll need to work around. For Watcher Knights, we go up and make the chandelier fall, as doing this is less inputs than killing an extra Watcher Knight. After we kill the first Watcher of the fight, our spell inputs will be dealing double the damage to the boss's max health, as, ideally, both of the Watcher Knights you're fighting will be in the path of the fireball. I'm not doubling the nail along with this, or counting any times that they would do this rolling attack and give us 2 to 3 hits with one spell, as I'm trying to be as fair as possible with this already massive exception we've set up for ourselves. For Umu, the fight is already kind of optimized down to the input, so all we have to do is count the inputs that are in the 2-cycle damage rotation, 6 nails and 5 fireballs, along with how many inputs it takes to dodge an optimal attack cycle. 2 short, 1 long, no extra. We only ideally need to move for the 1 long attack, which you can dodge just by jumping to the top of the wall and sliding down. Finally, we come to THK. This boss has far too much RNG, with me being comfortable to do the same HP reduction strat we've been doing for the past bosses. So for him, I decided to do something special. For THK, we're going to be doing something similar to we did with our playthroughs from earlier. We're going to fight him 5 times, count our inputs in real time for each, and then take the average of all of them together. This was surprisingly as easy done as said. It turns out there are only a certain number of inputs you can get in for each punish THK has, namely the double fireball hit on his dash, this spray attack, and this larger spray attack he does in the 3rd phase. So, all we had to do was count which attacks he did, multiply those by the total damage done by set inputs during the punish, and repeat this until his HP becomes 0. Finally, we have truly mathematically correct Hollow Knight. Every single input has been planned. This is, without a doubt, the perfect Hollow Knight run. Our final number for inputs is 1766. Huh? What was that? Which input is that number for? Oh, you poor innocent viewer. That's the total. 1,766 inputs completely beats the game. Here's those numbers spread out. Neat. Massive thanks to my friend Altscop who programmed Harold. This video could not have happened without him. Harold is the GOAT. Thanks, buddy. It's always fun to pick this game apart. Whether I'm doing math in Pantheon 5 or just a normal old speedrun, I will always be glad to give my favorite game another visit. See you next time.